This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hey, Andrew, what's going on?
Yo, so there was a big deploy this week.
The HBO Max one?
No, well, that was a big deploy too. Shout out that person, now internet famous. I was talking about Jason's shipment.
Yeah, Jason is not with us because the baby came early and all is well. He told me, I think they got home today from the hospital. So
much love to him and his family.
Totally. That's super exciting. And I'm sure he will be joining us in the future, but he will have his literal hands full for a few weeks, I'm sure. What's new with you?
Last week, I think it was last week, I was like, yeah, it's kind of hot in Arizona. This week, it's very hot in Arizona. It's like 120. I guess I did. It's big mad hot now. So
how prepared were you for the heat?
I have an inside, so very prepared.
Did you expect it to be as hot as it is? Or
I knew it was going to be hot. No, I don't think it was that surprising. I guess it was surprising to figure out like what 120 degrees feels like.
Yeah. I mean,
because there's no sweat unless you're like sitting in it. There's no humidity. There's nothing sticking to me. It's great.
It's a very different heat from super humid,
right?
Midwest or whatever. And
yeah, my back isn't sweating.
They started pouring footings for our house today. So around lunchtime, I went out there and was flying the drone around a little bit and taking pictures and stuff. But yeah, immediately opened that door and it starts sweating. And it's just, it's only 100 here, but it's humid and not the best. I hate it.
I mean, only 100. I sent a picture to my friend last night who's still in Wilmington. I was like, hey man, global warming is for sure real here.
Totally.
Yeah, what's been new with you? You got your footings?
Yeah.
Would you say you're on more solid ground this week?
Yeah. My plans are literally set in stone now. So, awesome. Yeah, other than that, we've been working on Hatchbox, getting some caddy things wrapped up and a few other things and hopefully getting that out the door pretty soon. But yeah, I don't know. It's just been like a busy week of the house stuff is more distracting than you would expect. So it's...
You're talking to someone with ADHD, bro. I'm always distracted. I'm sure I would not.
Now I know what it feels like.
Constant pain. Well, this week on the show, we have Cameron Dutro. Cameron's a Ruby on Rails developer. He works for Salesforce from the Bay Area. Welcome, Cameron. We're excited to talk to you about some cool stuff this week.
Hey, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Listened to the show for a while. It's a real honor to be asked on.
Well, it's an honor to have you. It's always fun when people say it's an honor to be here or something about the show. And Chris and I are like, yeah, thanks. Like we just kind of talk to each other.
Yeah, to us, it's just hanging out as usual. And then you don't really know who's your audience or anything because you never see them. You never hear from them that much. And it's not like you're on stage or anything. Like it's just we're hanging out like usual every Friday. So welcome to the club.
Yeah. Hey, thank you.
So you've got some cool projects that you're working on. Let's dig into Kuby. I really want to hear about this because for the past few years, I've been like building a DevOps tool to basically set up like DigitalOcean servers and stuff. But it's not running on Kubernetes or anything. So this is a really interesting thing to dig into. So tell us about Kuby and how you got started on it and let's dig in.
So Kuby is a deployment solution, I guess you'd say. I don't want to call it a framework because it seems like everything's a framework now. It's just a system that you can use to deploy your Rails application to a Kubernetes cluster. So you might be wondering like, okay, so why Kubernetes? Why is Cameron sort of betting on this? I think that Kubernetes is a pretty amazing system. I actually used it in my previous job at Lumos Labs, and it was a system that I didn't have any experience with until the company decided they wanted to start deploying because we were using Capistrano before that, like a lot of Rails devs were, I think. So we wanted to switch to something that was a little bit more, resilient, I guess. Like we had a pretty good resilient system with Capistrano. We had, redundancy and whatnot, but it's pretty manually configured in most cases. So you have some kind of manually configured load balancer, like in AWS or something. And if one of your backend servers goes down, then the load balancer notices that and routes traffic to the healthy ones, et cetera. And that can be pretty manually configured. So like, you have to go into AWS, provision a load balancer, add your services to it, et cetera. That's what we were doing. So one of our employees at the time had some experience with Kubernetes on the DevOps team, and he just sort of advocated for it, and we moved over to it. I learned a ton from him about how it works. And I just became really impressed with how smooth, I guess it was. And obviously there's still a lot to configure in the Kubernetes land. By the way, it's abbreviated KATES, K8S, because there's 8 letters between the K and the S. So I might say KATES a couple of times here. But KATES is a really cool system because of all of the different parts of it that you can take leverage to do all this manual or the stuff that normally would be manual. So a good example of that is like load balancing. In KATES land, you would simply create a service. That service load balances between all of the different instances of your Rails app. So there's no manual configuration there. You just say, I want a service. I want it to proxy to these backend, they're called pods. And I can scale up and down as I want to, and that all happens automatically. So I started thinking about KATES as just the future of web applications because of how awesome it was as a platform. The other cool thing about KATES is that a lot of different hosts out there, so AWS, GCP, Azure, DigitalOcean, Linode, they all have Kubernetes clusters you can just spin up and not have to even worry about spinning up your own cluster. So that you hit a button, you get a cluster. And the cool thing is, if you were deploying at one point to I think is it Linode or Linode? I always say Linode.
Linode.
Then you can deploy there. Everything works great. And then if you're like, oh man, DigitalOcean has like a way better deal, I should go over and take advantage of this like price reduction over here. Then you can switch over without really making any code changes at all. Like you don't have to go provision anything. I mean, except the cluster, right? You go into their interface, you spin up a new cluster. And then when you run a kube control command, kube control being the main way that you interact with the cluster, all you have to do is point it at a different cluster, give it a different certificate and URL to talk to that cluster. And you can deploy to it without changing anything else in your code because everything's portable, everything's defined in declarative YAML files. So to me, it was just like this really cool system that I thought that more, especially Rails devs, could take advantage of. But there's really this learning curve that makes it kind of hard to get involved with it. And I would say this is true of Capistrano too. The difference maybe is that Capistrano, there's a lot more tutorials and people out there that have done a lot of work with it, but it still takes time to set up. So the idea was with Kuby that it's like a sort of a very simple out of the box, like you run a Rails generator, you get this kuby.rb file, which has most of the things already pre-populated in it. It's not very long. You specify things like your host name and maybe some credentials, container registry or something for your images. And then you run a couple of commands. And next thing, your app is live in the cluster that you set up in DigitalOcean or Linode or wherever else you want. So yeah, it's supposed to be like deeply integrated with Rails. It's supposed to be pretty turnkey, and it's just trying to be a much simpler, at least on the surface. It's supposed to wrap Kubernetes so that it makes it easy for Rails devs to deploy to it.
Yeah, this sounds awesome because like you were saying, the Capistrano stuff is going to have you set up a server, and then you got to drop in the IP address into the config and do a lot of configuration that's kind of hard coded, where with Kubernetes, it can spin up another node and you don't need to know the IP address or any of that stuff. It's just good to go. Whereas, yeah, your Capistrano configs are setting up for RBM, for ASDF and symlinking things, and then adding your sidekick restart command and whatever. And it is pretty tedious. But it feels like from what I've looked at with Kubernetes that the YAML configurations and stuff are a pain in the butt. So this looks like a really nice Ruby-ish way of configuring it without having to like get in the weeds of all of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can absolutely be swimming in YAML before anything even works with Kubernetes. It feels kind of like the old Java days, like when you're configuring like literally everything with XML. So I don't necessarily want to say, I made the mistake maybe earlier of saying that this is a simple solution. It's really not a simple solution. It's just easier than like manually doing it yourself with Kubernetes or with Capistrano because of the way the tool works. And it tries to abstract all that away from you. So you can just focus on your app, you can launch it, and then you don't have to worry about deploying it somewhere. So yeah, I mean, and to be honest, to be totally transparent, you might at some point run into problems with Kubernetes because there are going to be times when it does something you don't expect. A node goes down, a node being like one of your AWS instances or something. If that goes down, Kubernetes will try to self-heal, but if something goes wrong, it can be really useful to go in there and use kube control on your own and not use Kuby. But for the 99% use case maybe even just the 90% use case. It's kind of what Kuby's aimed at. So it should help you with 99% of all the things or 90% of the things you might run into deploying wise.
Yeah. So walk us through, if you're setting this up for the first time, you would go into, say, DigitalOcean and set up a Kubernetes cluster there. Do you have to define how many servers on DigitalOcean you set up, or can that be more dynamic?
The way that K8s does this, right? There's the concept of when you spin up a DigitalOcean droplet and you add it to your cluster, and you can specify in DigitalOcean how many you want. That's what you were saying before. So what K8s does is it notices how many, you register, and DigitalOcean does this for you. They register this node with the cluster, and then Kubernetes will use that node to schedule work on. So sort of the individual unit of work in Kubernetes land is called a pod. So it'll schedule pods on those nodes. So let's say you had 2 at the beginning and you wanted to scale up a little bit. In Kuby, you can say, I want more than 1 replica, which would say I want more than 1 instance of my Rails app running. But if the cluster doesn't have capacity for that, in other words, if it doesn't have enough physical nodes to schedule those pods on, then you'll have to go into DigitalOcean and say, I want another droplet. And once you do that, though, Kubernetes will automatically rebalance all the work onto those nodes, just have them mostly filled up to the same level. And then, of course, if you want more than 1 or 2 or 3 replicas or whatever, you scale that up, and those will also distribute over all the nodes.
Yeah, and that's the big selling point there, because the old Capistrano style would be pretty much 1 server equals 1 Rails server or whatever. Right, so you'd spin up another droplet to run another one, but you might set those up inefficiently, end up with a 16 gigs of RAM server and you're only using 4 gigs. And at least Kubernetes can say, look, your Rails app is only using X, so we can run 4 or 5 copies on the same server. And that makes it really convenient there. So it's almost like an additional layer in there, where with Capistrano, it's kind of dumb and it's just 1-to-1, more or less. And then Kubernetes can be smart about it and see here's all these resources. We can make efficient use of that, that is awesome.
Yeah, that's why I say I love Kubernetes so much. There's all this sort of automatic distribution stuff baked into it, the self-healing stuff baked into it. So for that reason, it's really nice as an alternative to Capistrano. Another really nice thing about it too is that it uses Docker images under the hood. So anything you deploy into Kubernetes has to be runnable as a Docker image or packaged as a Docker image. So Kuby also packages your Rails app up as a Docker image. And one of the commands that you run before you deploy is a build command. And so that just looks at your Rails app, finds out what gems you have, installs those in the container. It installs operating system dependencies like libxml, et cetera. It sees Nokogiri in your gem file, for example. So it tries to make that as turnkey as possible. Because when you're trying to run a Rails app on just your Mac or Linux machine or whatever, or even Windows, there's a lot of manual work, often installing all those packages. And you don't really want to have to reproduce that on your servers. And if you're using Capistrano or spinning up your servers, even with Chef or something, a lot of the manual work that you have to do per server is install all those things. But because Kuby and because Kubernetes use Docker, you just need to build your image once, and then you can deploy it anywhere. It's got all the dependencies you want packaged up with it, including gems and configuration and everything. So yeah, it ends up being really nice from that perspective too.
So how does it work with databases? Do you run your databases inside of Kubernetes, or do you use RDS or DigitalOcean managed databases, or how would you approach that?
So Kuby aims to be just totally turnkey. So it's just like Heroku. So it actually spins up a database in the cluster for you, and using this really cool project called KubeDB. KubeDB is just this, you create what's called a CRD, or a custom resource definition for a MySQL database or a Postgres. It also supports Elasticsearch and Redis and Memcache. So you stand these things up, and then you can connect to them, and they run in your cluster. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that for a big app or even a medium-sized app. This is just to get you off the ground so that you don't have to go and learn that stuff and do that stuff yourself. Because, let's be honest, Heroku is so easy that most Rails devs who are just working on a side project or something, they don't want to have to go learn how to stand up a database in production. They want to just push the code and go to lunch or whatever. I totally identify with that. I've definitely had that need a couple of times, where I've got this little side project. I don't want to spend forever configuring it, deploying it. I just wanted to put it up there and let it run and leave it alone. So that's, I would say, the built-in database support is kind of targeting that level of Rails dev. If you're working on something that's business critical, definitely go to AWS, launch an RDS instance, or do DigitalOcean's managed database system. And Kuby lets you do that. You can set a managed database false flag in your config, and it'll just skip all of that like in cluster database stuff. So yeah, it supports both, just long story short. And your use case is really going to determine which one you want to use.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty cool that I hadn't heard of KubeDB before, but that makes it really convenient. And I feel like that was one of those selling points that MongoDB had, where it was like, look, you don't have to run migrations. You don't even,
right.
You don't have to create a database. You just use it. And
totally.
So that really makes it easy for somebody brand new to a project like this. Spin it up and voila, you're good to go. And
yeah, for sure.
And that's almost certainly what you're going to do the first few times where you're testing it out and trying to understand it and learn it and everything, and makes it life a lot easier there. So with Kubernetes, you're not setting up a server in the normal sense. You're running Docker images. So you've got to think about things a little bit differently, right? With cron jobs and setting up Sidekick as a different process than Rails. And I guess one-off things like migrations, or even just SSHing into a console just to poke around at things. That's kind of a widespread question, but how do those things work in Kubernetes?
Yeah. So let me start at the end and talk about SSH. So like, you're totally right. It's a very different like way of managing applications. Like you don't really have access. Well, I mean, you do. On DigitalOcean, I was going to say you don't really have access to the server itself. I mean, you do, because in DigitalOcean, when you start up a new droplet, like it gives you an IP address. You can SSH into that just like you would any other server that they give you, even if it's not managed by Kubernetes. But generally speaking, you don't need to do that, because the abstraction layer that Kubernetes gives you is such that you almost never need to know what it's actually doing on the host. You just need to look at one of the pods it's running and find out what that pod is doing. So think about a pod, by the way, is, again, just one instance of your Rails app running. Like it's logging to standard out. So every time a request is made, it's logging to standard out, and you can go stream the logs from it. It manages all that for you. To SSH in, you do what's called an exec command, and Kuby has like a wrapper around this. So you can say, I think it's, bundle exec Kuby remote shell, and it'll just drop you into a shell inside one of your Rails pods, like the first one it finds, if you have more than one. You can also do like remote console to get like a Rails console. You can do remote DB console to get like your database console. And then you can also do a bunch of other Kubernetes commands to inspect what's going on in your cluster. But yeah, so that's kind of the general way. Like it's different totally in the sense that you don't have a server to connect to, but you still have pods. You can execute commands in and see what's going on there. I'm forgetting the other parts of your question.
Things like cron and running like migrations. And I guess that partly runs migrations, are basically running a Rails console, like same kind of concept. Yeah. But I guess you may want to include that as part of your deployment or something too.
Right. Yeah. And so actually Kuby will do that automatically. When you deploy, it will run migrations for you. Look on deploy, which you may not want. So you can tell it, actually, come to think of it, I don't think you can tell it not to do that. That'd be a good feature to add. But yeah, you probably should be able not to tell it to do that.
PR's welcome.
PR's welcome. Yeah. Hey, by the way, Kuby is definitely still a work in progress. If you have interest in this, please send me all your codes. Yeah. So it's for Sidekick. So there's a Sidekick plugin. So Kuby does support like a plugin system where you can like add additional features and functionality to it. So there is a Sidekick plugin. You just say add plugin Sidekick, and it like spins a Redis up for you and starts a couple of worker pods. And so you just can shove stuff into Redis that way and process that stuff with the workers, and it gets deployed with your app. So there's lots of cool like extension or like extensibility. I wrote the Sidekick plugin just as a proof of concept that this is how you would do this. But I have to imagine there's a lot of other use cases that I haven't thought of, like plugins that could be super useful for other like things you might want to do with Rails. So like cron jobs is a good example, actually. Like people use Clockwork a lot, or what's another good example of a cron system people use? The one that we use at Lumos Labs is called Clockwork. And you like right now, there's not a plugin for that, but I could totally see somebody like, working on a plugin that launches another pod that just runs like all your clocks also, and just makes it super easy. Just like drop in and add plugin Clockwork, and you're like good to go.
Yeah. Is that like creating scheduled jobs inside of, so is like that a concept that Kubernetes knows about, that it can kick off a Docker image to run a command every once in a while, or would you be instead running a separate service?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So actually, now that you mentioned that, so Kubernetes does have its own like cron job system. You can specify like an object of type cron job and give it like that cron string when to run, and it'll like invoke commands inside whatever image you have. Yeah, the unreadable. I always have to look up that format. Yeah. Yeah. So it does have that. The last time I looked into it, it wasn't particularly reliable for some reason. Like it would run things like in some cases, like several minutes after they were supposed to run, for example. Huh. And then even had this documented on their site. They were like, yeah, maybe don't use this yet. I didn't want to go and use it. So like clockwork example, that would be a separate process and a separate pod. It wouldn't be anything special like in Kate's land. It would just be like your Rails app running, but like a different process than Rails S,
Gotcha. Yeah.
Like Puma. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people use Sidekick Cron and other things like that. Cause
right, sure.
A lot of times Cron is just going to spin up jobs at a certain time. And, you get the retriability of the job, like if it fails. And so it makes a lot of sense for using something that's tied to Sidekick or something like that anyways. So
right. It's like, why would you want to use all the resources? Because you're really using your same Rails app, because your jobs really potentially need to make use of all the code that's in your Rails app. But if they only need to run at certain times, like why use the resources up to have a pod in your cluster that's like basically doing nothing 90% of the time? So yeah, it'd be cool to add something like that would be a little more efficient.
Yeah, this project sounds pretty awesome. I'm going to have to try it because just the daunting tutorials of spinning up Kubernetes and all the YAML files and just everything changes so fast too that I've tried it a couple times and just made it a ways, but it wasn't to the point where I fully understood it. And this seems like a great way to just dig in. And the other thing too is I didn't really want to maintain and upgrade Kubernetes myself and try and deal with that. So now you have a lot of managed services where DigitalOcean can do it for you, AWS can do it, and you don't have to worry about that piece. You just use it now.
Yeah.
And you get your own mini Heroku, and that's pretty sweet.
Yeah, for sure. To me, that's the dream. Can I do as little work as possible but get all the benefits of this cool system? And the answer is increasingly yes with all these managed systems.
Yeah. So do you have any future plans on features and things you want to add? Or is it kind of like you're working on the core, or where are you at on it?
So I think at this point, the core is pretty solid, even though we're only at 0.12 or something right now. And really, it's hard to feel confident in something that abstracts this much complexity because I'm always worried that I'm going to launch this thing and people are going to be like, oh, nice, it's 1.0. That means it'll never break. So it's a little nerve-wracking from that perspective. And one of the big things that I just ran into is the database with KubeDB. That stuff is really cool, but it also is it's difficult to upgrade your database, especially with zero downtime with a system like that. Because to be totally frank with you, databases are not really designed to run in Kubernetes, right? They're designed to run on the single server that never goes down and has a bunch of people making sure that it's not going down. Because it's a single point of failure that most people have in their systems, right? In their apps. Mm-hmm. So to what I'm working on right now is a way to zero downtime migrate to a new version of KubeDB inside your cluster. That's proven to be really difficult because you're dealing with a lot of different sort of roadblocks. For example, the KubeDB operator runs in your system and listens for these requests. It listens for things like when the cluster says, I want a Postgres instance, and listens to that. And it says, okay, I've got a request for a new Postgres instance. Here's all the configuration, all the things you want that instance to do, like how many replicas there are and what the credentials are. And it goes and stands up a Postgres instance for you and lets you connect to it. But it's really opaque, how you do anything else with it from there. If I want to, and so to actually just step back a minute, the first thing that I had to work on was how do you uninstall the old version of the operator and then install the new version, but keep your existing database running? Because if you delete the operator, KubeDB really wants you to also delete all the databases that it's managing, which obviously is a non-starter. You can't just go and delete your running database. That's ridiculous. Yeah. So I had to figure out these weird ways of forcing it to not try to delete everything. That was rough. And also one thing I should mention too is that your KubeDB is at the cluster level. So you can't have two different versions of it installed at the same time. So you install the first version and then put the new one on. So that's working fine. But then the question is how do you get a new version of so the way that the KubeDB does this too is it says, what's the version of this config that you've given me? And if that version doesn't match the version of KubeDB that you're running. So in other words, if I have Postgres and it's V1 Alpha 1, and I want to upgrade to KubeDB, the next version, and that only recognizes objects of type V1 Alpha 2, then I can't just say, hey, manage this old one that I have. It's a different version. It needs to be something that like it has launched by itself to make sure all that config is correct, right? So like you try to run commands against it and it's, hey, this is the wrong version. I don't know what you're talking about. What are you doing? What are you doing? I don't understand this version of this object. So what I'm having to do is launch a new Postgres instance, set up replication between the old one and the new one, wait for the replication to do its thing, and then somehow like seamlessly switch over to that new one. Anyway, it's a huge nightmare and I'm regretting doing it this way. So that's another plug for like use a managed database because it's just going to be so much easier on you.
Yeah, that sounds pretty tough because even just like without the operator upgrade stuff, Postgres 12 to 13 is going to want you to run the Postgres database upgrade thing as part of that. So that's got to be pretty tough to do because now you're upgrading several different things all at once without downtime, hopefully. And
I didn't even talk about the Postgres. Yeah, that stuff really. So it's a whole other part of it. Anyway, yeah.
I've worked on several applications at this point, and I've noticed that regardless of the business or application, there are a few support requests that you will inevitably see at one point or other. Is the site down? I was supposed to get that email and it never came. And inevitably something doing with the cache. And with Honeybadger, you can answer all of these questions and more. You don't need a fleet of different monitoring tools for just your cron or your front end and your back end. Get all the answers to whether that scheduled task for that email ran without an error, the site speed and whether there's a problem, which users are being affected if there is a problem, and what specific error is causing that issue. Set up in minutes or click the one button on Heroku. It's that easy. I literally did it right before this recording. Give Honeybadger a try. Let them know Remote Ruby sent you. Be like a Honeybadger with no cares because you know they have your back 24/7.
If you stopped your, I guess like your database and stuff, does that store that in a volume somewhere so that if you turned off Kubernetes for a day or 5 minutes or something to upgrade or whatever, that you still get to keep your databases?
Yeah, definitely. And the KubeDB tries really hard to make your database not lose data if it gets restarted or whatever, or dies for some reason. That can happen sometimes. And that's why they say that it's safe to use because they make all these guarantees because of all the cool functionality that Kubernetes has now around persistent volumes and persistent volume claims. It's like network attached storage. I want this NAS essentially attached to, and it's not network attached. It's like legit attached, but it's like network attached in the sense that you can swap it in and out. Like you can attach it to a node in your system and then detach it and then reattach it later if you want to. Like under the hood, that's using EBS block volumes and stuff in Amazon and like other similar things in other systems, other clouds. So yeah, it's really solid that way. You're not going to lose data really, but it's the upgrading that's really the challenge there.
Well, it explains a lot of if you've used managed databases in Heroku, multi emails a week about, hey, we're doing maintenance on your database again. Right. That is a very regular thing. I feel like the database management part of things is maybe the harder thing than actually just running an application in an image. Like you can spin it up, shut it down, restart it. All those things are pretty safe to do. But when you're talking about your database, there's critical stuff there. And that's the piece that can't just disappear. Like you can have a Rails server disappear and whatever, you'll just direct traffic somewhere else. But when your database is gone, that's a different story.
I feel like you have to be really careful, like when you make a tool like this, to let people know, hey, okay, look, this is how it works. And I should probably put more documentation in about this, but this is how it works. This is the use case that it supports. And if you don't feel comfortable with this, then like definitely go with a managed database.
Well, that sounds awesome. Kuby is something I'm going to have to try out and play with because the simplicity of it makes it look like it's going to be much, much easier to get started with and use on just getting to know Kubernetes and stuff. You're going to make it a million times easier, I think. So
yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
The other thing we wanted to talk about today was Rux. And Andrew, you can dig into this one because I think this is very up your alley.
This is very up my alley. I think the funny thing is I once sent this link to Rux to Jason and Chris one time before we knew who you were, before Kuby, because someone requested that we talk to you about Kuby. So that's how this kind of came to be. And then I started finding other projects that you had done, like Scuttle, which is awesome and people can check out, which we can link to in the show notes, but I don't think we're going to have quite enough time to talk about today. But Rux is another cool one. And it's basically your kind of take on templating almost in a componentized manner. And I actually tried it. So you want to give like the pitch about what it is and then we can talk about it?
Yeah. So Rux is it's like JSX for Ruby. So if you've ever used JSX in JavaScript, like in React land, you know that like you've got your React code and you have a component potentially in your React code. And there's like a render method. And then you can stick what look like HTML tags directly in your source code in the render method. And that will be transpiled essentially into React create, create element commands, I think, or create element function calls.
I'm not sure. I don't do that React.
Yeah, I don't. It doesn't even matter. Like React will take that stuff and turn it into JavaScript that's like interpretable by your browser, right? But the JSX code like looks really streamlined and simple. It's like, it looks like HTML. And so it's a lot like more expressive. Like you don't have to go write a bunch of like random create element calls or whatever. You can just like stick with HTML in your code and you can render other components with it by specifying the name of the component as the tag name. So that's JSX. I think most people are familiar with it at this point, but that's all in JavaScript land. And so Joel Hoxley and GitHub came out with Vue Component a couple of years ago, maybe last year. That was a very similar sort of shift from thinking about the view as just a string basically, or like a template, to thinking about it in terms of components. So in this Vue Component world, you can render a Vue Component, but a Vue Component is just a class, and that class renders a template in most cases. And then that template can be like injected into other templates, and you can compose all this stuff together, compose your components together, just like you can do with React, but you can do it in Rails. And I thought, well, okay, so you've got these like verbose render calls everywhere for this, and you also would need to like new up all of your components and pass them into render, et cetera. And I was thinking like, boy, wouldn't it be nice if you could just use HTML for this, like you can do in JSX? And so that's what Rux is all about. Like it's Vue components written as HTML elements, like directly in your source code.
Right. And I know there are people out there screaming, just chill out. So the thing that's really cool about Rux, which is like, I know something you were talking about, is like being able to write more verbose templates kind of with your Vue components. A lot of people out there, but you can do that. Yes, you can. You can have a separate HTML ERB, or if you're cool, you have a HAML file that's separate from the component. That's where you can write your markup, and you can use it almost just like a controller view kind of like relationship where your component passes stuff into that HTML ERB, and then it all goes back up. But there's a way to do inline components via the call method, or if you can use call with variant, which is basically a method that goes inside of the component that's special, that Vue component recognizes like, hey, this is a render inline. So a lot of people, which when I say a lot of people, I really mean me. And then I know people do this in JavaScript world, is that instead of having, if you kind of adhere to this idea of like atomic components, which I do very much, then you have, let's say, a really simple button component. And then maybe to compose up another view, like they talk about a lot in GitHub, they have multiple buttons, and then they have these other smaller components that they compose together. And for those smaller components, having a button.html.erb or button component.html.erb is ridiculous, because it's maybe one line of HTML, maybe two. And you can do this right now in Rails by using like content tag helpers. But if you've ever used content tag helpers and the tag helpers, you know that there's quirkiness, there's weirdness. It's kind of a pain to write. You have to remember the syntax. What Rux allows you to do is basically just write the HTML there, and then it gets kind of converted into Ruby by Rux, right? Am I on the right path?
That's right. Yeah, totally correct.
So if you adhere to a lot of components, right? Or you have atomic components, you have a ton of components, your tree is massive, and then they all have an HTML.erb, like that's a pain. It's a pain to like have to go through all of them. So what I found that the nice part about Rux is that I take all these smaller components, or even maybe the bigger ones, and I put the HTML directly in the call method, just like you would do. That's why it's kind of like JSX. It was hard for me to kind of make the connection at first, but that's how you would do it in a React component, where you have inline in the component in their return method, which for a Vue component is the call method. You write out your HTML, and then Rux converts that into Ruby for you. So now you have one Rux file with your button stuff, and you can have logic in it. You can write Ruby directly inside of that without having to do the whole ERB dance. And I think it's cool.
Yeah, thank you.
That's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, thank you. It's perfect explanation. Yeah. And thank you for clarifying that there's like a difference between the template that you can store on disk, like ERB file that your component can render, versus the call method, which is like an inline template. Yeah, that's really a key, I think, differentiator, because view component by default doesn't really, well, that's not true. You can definitely use the call method inside your view components, but imagine having just, because what your call method is going to be in like a regular view component land is just a giant string of ERB code. So it's like, why would you not just stick that in a file? So Rux is like much more like treating your template as code. So there's like syntax highlighting. There's like, plugins for VS Code, Sublime Text, and Atom. So you can load that stuff into your editor. You can like syntax highlighting, which it's not like you don't get that in ERB, but you get less of that in ERB, I think. And you can also embed Ruby inside your Rux code, and that gets syntax highlighted too. So yeah, to me, it's like a less verbose, more expressive way of writing your view component templates.
And kind of because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm not going to get into it, just side projects with Andrew. But for me, the argument of whether to use Rux isn't so much, I mean, it obviously could be, but the true power of Rux isn't if you're using a bunch of ERB partials, right? If that's the way you build components, you build them with a ton of ERB partials, then maybe Rux isn't really for you, because the mindset of thinking that you have to be in, you're not going to be able to take as much advantage of Rux. Where it comes into handy is like where I mentioned, where you have a lot of inline components. And like you said, yeah, you could write ERB there, but you could basically just do big ass here doc right there.
Yeah.
And put all your, but blah. And then you could do it with the content tag helpers. And again, blah. There's ways to do it. None of them are great. Rux is what provides you a nice way to do it. That's where I would begin the argument. If you're already kind of committed to this idea of having atomic components and trying to write the majority, like you don't want to write HTML, you want to write Ruby, you don't want to mess with a ton of ERB, that's where you start considering Rux. But if you're just married to ERB partials, then you're not really even in the mindset to take advantage of what Rux provides. And I don't think the value of Rux really shows itself until you're in that position.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. What I'm hoping is that eventually a lot of Rails devs will see the value in creating smaller components, just like the React world has. And Vue component from GitHub is like the game changer here. Rux is really not the game changer. Rux is just like a layer on top of the Vue component library, framework, whatever you want to call it, that the GitHub worked on. Like Vue component's hugely cool because it does encourage you, and there's so many good benefits to using it, right? It encourages you to make things small. It encourages you to make things testable. So you can stick your Vue logic into the single class. Then your test, you can render that single thing and assert that it's got the correct HTML output in it, right? So lots of goodness there. The thing that I think maybe the most powerful thing about Vue component, though, is that it enables these Vue component libraries. So like you could ostensibly, and GitHub has actually done this, they have their primer Vue components. I think it's just called Vue GitHub/Vue components, which is not Vue component, right? Vue component is the framework, and the plural version of that is like all of their primer Vue components that you can start to use in your own applications. So you could potentially like render a GitHub style button in your app by just dropping in a gem. And then I guess you have to include the CSS and JS if you want to get it fully working. But like you can render a Vue component, just one of their buttons, one of their drop downs, headers, whatever you want, like all that stuff is packaged up for you in this like design system gem. So what I can imagine is like that happening for Bootstrap, and that happening maybe for like certain Tailwind. Maybe, I mean, Tailwind is super configurable, right? But so like certain Tailwind.
I already went down this path. Don't do it. I've already done this. I started this before Primer. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Not worth it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, unless you have a lot of resources, GitHub is doing it because they have a ton of people who are like tasked with, because they want to make everything, as far as I know, they want to make everything like very uniform across all of their pages and properties and whatnot. So it makes sense for them to do it. I don't know if it makes sense for an individual to do it, but I can totally see Bootstrap becoming like a set of Vue components.
We'll see Bootstrap, and maybe I should clarify. Definitely, if you have a design system and it's written in Tailwind, definitely port that over and make your own engine if you want. If you have multiple Rails apps, there's multitudes of reasons why you would do that. What I'm saying is like, I had this idea very early on that just Bootstrap, or just like they had done with Primer, I would basically make Tailwind view component where you can leverage all of Tailwind's helpers and stuff as arguments into view component. And that was a stupid idea because not only is it incredibly hard and like a lot of work, it's also defeats the main point of using Tailwind. If you have components that take all of the arguments that Tailwind can provide, so what are you even doing at this point?
Oh, that's a really good point, because Tailwind's whole thing is you don't need more structure than what it already gives you. Because the whole point of it is just like decorate your HTML. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, because I was creating because it's kind of how Primer has it, where they have these keywords that are like, if you try to add in classes, but there's a keyword for the class, like PX. So in a Primer view component, you can do view component.new PX2, but then you can also pass additional like string array of classes. So then I can do classes, MX2, stuff like that. If there's already a argument for it, so going back to the PX2, then if I try to add the class into the class's string array PX2, it'll stop me and be like, hey, no, we already have a way for you to do this. So that's why I was trying to do that basically with Tailwind, and we did the same idea where everything has PX2 and then screen, and then you could specify the screen. When I'm like, this is ridiculous. I'm just moving like class names into Ruby as arguments for no reason. But anyway, so what is your like vision for Rux? Why should people use this?
I mean, I want Rux to be a JSX for Ruby, right? That's sort of the goal number one that I had for it. And that's what it currently does. But I think there's a much bigger conversation that we could have around transpiling Ruby in general. Because, I mean, I don't necessarily, I mean, I hear people cringing in the background. Oh my gosh, transpiling Ruby, that sounds like a terrible idea. Because look what happened to JavaScript. There's so many transpilation steps that JavaScript goes through now. Styled components and JSX and all these other things that like these cool sort of syntactical things you could stick into your files that like eventually transpile into something that a browser can interpret. And I think that there's still a lot of benefit though to transpiling, because it lets us get to, I would say, almost like new dialects of Ruby that are potentially more powerful, right? Like I think that the abstractions in JavaScript in JSX are like one of the big reasons that React succeeded. Like the fact that you can write HTML and your render methods in React components is like super awesome. Like having to do all of the manual work there would just be a total, I think, non-starter for a lot of people. It would be way too verbose. Nobody would want to do it. They might still do it, but I think it would be a huge barrier. So, that being the case, the transpilation in that case really helped adoption of the framework. And now like everybody does React, right? I don't think that I'm shooting for the same like level of adoption for Rux necessarily. I don't want it to be like the reason people use view components. I think view components stand on their own pretty well. But I do think that I think transpilation in general has a place in the Ruby community, because I would love to make certain parts of writing Ruby easier. Like I love the Ruby language. It is fantastic. Like the best language I've ever used, hands down. But I mean, just like every other language out there, there's things that can be improved about it, right? And we've seen a number of times that's been the case, like a number of attempts at improving the language. Sorbet, for example, adding type definitions or type annotations to Ruby. That's a huge thing that I think more of us should probably do in our apps and our gems. I mean, I definitely have come across, like Kuby, for example, not all of it, but big chunks of Kuby have type annotations. And I've definitely caught several bugs as a result of running SRBTC and checking the types in Kuby. And I think that I wouldn't have caught those if it hadn't been for that tool. Or I may have caught them, but it would have been a long time down the road. And maybe somebody encounters that in production or trying to deploy something to production. So that's a good example of something that's really changed recently. This sort of front-end renaissance in Rails is another thing that's been, and that's not really Ruby specific, but I think that we can make it Ruby specific with something like Rux, where it's like we're supporting view components better, like at the language level. And then I also think that there are other like things that, like I write Python, unfortunately, now as part of my day job. I used to be a Ruby Rails guy back when I was at Lumos Labs. For the last year, I've been writing Python. And there's nothing like using another language to make you sort of appreciate that language and how it's designed. And I don't think that Python is as good a language as Ruby. I just flatly don't think that. But I do think that there are some parts to Python that are really cool. One of those is imports. So import statements in your files in Python are cool because they let you know exactly what other code that file depends on. So if I want to know where this module came from, I don't have to like Command T or Command J or whatever in VS Code to find it and maybe get the right file. I can literally go to the top of that file and see the import at the top and say, oh yeah, that's where it came from. That module path like points to a path on disk. I can go find that file, like that exact file. And like in VS Code, I can also give it command click on it and open that file in my editor. That's really cool. I think that Ruby could benefit from something like that. If we had import statements that declare exactly what code you're using from other files. Now, in some ways, it's not possible in Ruby because Ruby is just one giant VM. And when you start up and finding things in it, it doesn't really matter where they came from. They're all in the same VM. But you can still do this in a faux manner. You can have, for example, constants. Let's say I wanted to reference the view component base or active record base, maybe constant, in my Rux file or my Ruby file. I have an import statement at the top that says import base from view component. And then I can just use base wherever I want, like as an alias maybe in that file. So it works for aliases, but it also declares exactly where that constant came from. If I'm looking up the word base just in the file, I come across that and I don't know where it comes from in Rails now, I don't really have any way of telling what base that's talking about unless I do a lot of manual spelunking. Like I can go look at, is there a base that's defined in the same namespace as I'm in right now? Maybe, but like, where's that file? So it's a manual process now. I think we could really help that with some kind of import. I don't want to say import system, but like import hinting. So import this constant from here. I know that's where it comes from. And so I actually have a branch in Rux that does this. You can add import statements to the top, and every time you reference a constant, you can turn on a feature that says, if I reference a constant that hasn't been imported, blow up with an error when on transpilation. And it also means that you can provide like a bunch of aliasing too. So I can import base from view component and then just use base instead of like view component : base. So it cuts down the verbosity there. So import statements are a really cool thing from Python that I think Ruby could really benefit from. Again, not true imports, but like a import style hinting system. And then I talked about sorbet type hinting too as a really cool step forward for Ruby. It would be much cooler though, in my opinion, if the type information was in line in your source code. So instead of like, if a function, instead of saying foo, and then at the top having a sig like params foo, right, string, you could simply say foo : capital S string, and that would get by the transpiler turned into a sorbet type annotation, like in the RBI file or something. It's the best of both worlds. Like you've got inline types and you've also got like sorbet doing all the heavy lifting of actually doing the type checking. Those are the big things. Oh, and then I also want to add source maps. So I've got three big ideas: source maps, imports, and inline type annotations that I want to do for Rux.
The import thing is very interesting because I came from Python to Ruby. And the weirdest part of Ruby to me was, where the hell does any of this come from? There's no information on these classes, where they come from or anything. And that was very strange to me. And like the idea of just building a controller in Rails, and there's some before action stuff and params, and then you just don't really know where it comes from. And I guess too, the other thing that I love about Ruby, but was hard to pick up on was, okay, you have no idea ever if it's a variable or a method when the parentheses are missing. And it was like, what is params? Is that just a variable or is that a method? Or I don't know, because, there's never any explicit statement where it comes from here and it's this type and whatever. It was the strangest thing, because when you go to Python or these other languages, it's a lot more obvious. And yeah, I'm with you on that like, that seems to be one of those things that would make it a lot easier to get started with. When you pick up the Rails source code for the first time and you're trying to fix a bug, you don't have to go read through 50 different files or like search GitHub and poke around a ton. You would be able to trace it back way, way easier. Yeah. And even some of that in the Rails source code, like you'll find a random class and it's doing some stuff, and you pass them some variables into the initializer, and you don't know what the types are. And is this an instance of another class or an array or a symbol or whatever? And it makes it, it's a struggle. That's an interesting thing. Like I see the direction of that. A lot of people are like, what if we had a bit more of that? Or like, at least it's optional or whatever the case. Because one of my friends and I we were brainstorming a long time ago, and we're like, it'd be amazing if you could have the best of both worlds, where you could have Rails and Crystal, where at the beginning you could do it like Ruby, everything's duck typed. But when you're ready for production, you can start defining all your types and making them strict, and then make your code eventually fully compilable so that you could do it scripted at first and then have this super efficient version of it for production. And you don't really get that in Crystal yet. It still requires you to define types constantly, but it's a step in the right direction. I think there's like that magical place where eventually you'll probably get there where some language can do kind of fully scripted, duck typed everything and then move into some really cool compiled, super performant version.
Well, and you're talking about
that's really
new apps. What about legacy apps? That's where I want this. Like, where does this come from in a legacy app is 90%, if not 100% of the first couple of weeks you're on the project.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it's like the same question about if your legacy app has tests or not. Type annotations, in my opinion, are kind of like a form of testing. You can see exactly what's being passed in, and that gives you more confidence about refactoring. And then I think tests do the same thing. As far as like how you add this to a legacy app, hopefully it's gradual. Just like you would do testing pretty gradually. Hopefully typing, imports, rucks, whatever, that stuff is also fairly gradual. Add an import statement, see if it transpiles, add another one, see if it transpiles, and you just keep going from there.
Well, we are running on time. So I just wanted to say before we completely finish that you can also do all of this with Bridgetown, because that's where I've been doing it. And I got to get my Bridgetown shout out in today. There was just a big new release. So I'm having fun doing that. And that's where the first time I was like, okay, maybe this is where Rux would really shine. Is I was like, I wanted to add in a bunch of SVGs as inline kind of like method, like variants. So instead of pulling from all these files using Snowpack or whatever, svg.call with or whatever the with variance is, and then have the Rux create that SVG right there in line as a method. Mm-hmm. Anyway, super cool. You can, if anyone's interested, obviously let me know. I can talk about more. But thanks for coming on. That was a lot. That was cool. We got some cool areas, climbed all up and down the stack. So Cameron, if anyone wants to find you online, wants to see what you're doing, wants to learn more, where they go?
Sure. So I'm online pretty much everywhere as @Camertron, CAMERTRON. That's my GitHub name and also my Twitter name. So you can reach me on those platforms. And yeah, look forward to chatting with you.
Sweet. And you have a Bridgetown site, just FYI. I know that.
Oh, yeah. Right. That's true. Actually, another huge shout out to Bridgetown. Like, I was looking for a way to start a blog really easily. And I was like, okay, Jekyll's cool. I've used that before with GitHub Pages, but I've heard about this Bridgetown thing. That looks super cool too. And man, it was so easy. I just like gem installed a couple things, generated, and I was off to the races, and it was super easy. So big shout out to Bridgetown. Really cool system.
If you're loco like me, you're writing your templates in Ruby now with the latest release. So anyway, talk about it another time. We need to get Jared on the show. Cameron, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Yeah, and we'll be back next week, probably without Jason, but
probably without Jason.
Go
online.
All good.
Wish Jason happy shipping.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I noticed about this episode is just that there's like a big reduction in the number of jokes at Andrew's expense because Jason's here. So
thank you for pointing that out. See, because I was internalizing that, but thank you for pointing that out. Yes, it is much more safe here for me without Jason's flames.
On that note,
yeah,
we'll catch you next week.